Welcome to Science and Wisdom Live, where scientists and meditators meet.
Hello, everybody. I'm Scott Snibbe, and I'm very, very pleased to be here today to introduce this extraordinary dialogue between Annaka Harris and Geshe Tenzin Namdak on the origins of consciousness. Before we start, though, I'd like to tell people that this dialogue is part of an ongoing exploration of consciousness that's been going on for a few years now. And some of the earlier discussions are now compiled into a self-paced course called Exploring Consciousness that you can find on our website. And it features some of those past dialogues with people like Carlo Rovelli that are really fantastic. So check it out if you get a chance and you find yourself interested after this. I almost don't need to introduce these speakers. I think a lot of people on the call already know about them. But Annaka Harris has the extraordinary distinction of having written a bestseller about consciousness. Not an easy topic to get a best-selling book about. So congratulations. It has like thousands of reviews on Amazon. Wonderful book. And she's also the writer and producer of the audio documentary series Lights On that I've been enjoying over the last few weeks and highly recommend too. Her work has been in the New York Times, Nautilus Magazine, Journal of Consciousness Studies, and many more. She's also an editor consultant for science writers and who's specializing, of course, in neuroscience and physics. And she's also written a children's book called I Wonder, and done many other wonderful things, including teaching mindfulness for the organization Inner Kids. Geshe Tenzin Namdak is one of my teachers, an extraordinary Buddhist teacher with an extraordinary level of wisdom, insight, and joy, quite often laughing through his deep conversations about Buddhism, which really keeps you engaged. He started out as an environmental researcher in the Netherlands, and then started studying Buddhism, and that led to becoming ordained as a monk, and then becoming Geshe, which is a course of study that takes at least 20 years. And he's one of the very few Westerners to have attained that distinction. For those that don't know the title, the Dalai Lama is a Geshe. That's kind of the title you get from having studied very, very deeply the Tibetan Buddhist topics. Now he's the resident teacher at Jamyang, and he and Annaka are going to be in conversation. He's been building many bridges between Buddhist and Western thought. He's been teaching at Oxford also recently, and I'm very much looking forward to their conversation. You may not hear much from me because they're both quite skilled conversationalists, but I'm going to launch you both with the first question that you both wanted to discuss, which is whether consciousness is fundamental. Take it from here.
Yeah, welcome, and
Thank you.
very much thank you for being here with us today.
Yes,
and yeah, maybe the first question, the answer should come from you, I think, because you have talked about consciousness being fundamental quite a lot.
Yeah. It's was a surprise to me actually in my work that this was something that I started to consider. That it was even something that was a possibility that consciousness was fundamental. I originally started wondering through my work with neuroscientists whether consciousness goes deeper in nature than the sciences have previously assumed. I started seeing more and more evidence of that through my work in the sciences, and also through our better understanding of how the brain works and how many of our intuitions about consciousness, what its function is, have actually been undermined by the current science, by our better understanding the brain. And that much of this work and research had not quite penetrated to the level of conversation within the sciences and even within philosophy about how these new discoveries about how the brain works actually undermine what our assumptions are about consciousness. And so as Scott mentioned, I published a book about consciousness in 2019. And through the process of writing that book, by the end of the book, I was convinced that it is a completely, not only legitimate, but very important scientific question actually to be asking. Is it possible that consciousness is fundamental? I'm sorry to say I don't yet have an answer. I don't know if we ever will. But I do believe it's a legitimate scientific question. I think there is a very good chance that it is not just that it runs deeper in nature than we have assumed, but that it actually goes all the way down, and is maybe the most fundamental stuff of the universe. So maybe I'll stop there. I can keep talking, but do you tell me what your thoughts are?
Yeah, so I mean,
Yeah.
it depends, of course.
Yeah.
First of all,
Yes.
how you define being
Yes.
fundamental.
That's a good place to start. Oh,
That's a good
yeah.
place.
And how you define consciousness also.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that we can already probably fill at least an hour with it. Yeah. So,
Yes.
so yeah. First of all, in the Buddhist kind of
Mm.
teaching, so to say, or the Buddhist mind science, we have a particular definition for consciousness. It's good to have a definition that is simple and small, and then elaborate on that.
Mm.
As many people in the field of neuroscience also try to do the same thing to keep. Yeah.
Yes.
So we start with consciousness being kind of clear and knowing. Yeah. So clear has the aspect that things can appear to the mind, or things can be experienced by the mind, so to say.
Yes. Yeah.
And there's also an aspect of cognition. Things can be known, right? So that's kind of one aspect as we define consciousness.
Yeah.
And then if consciousness is fundamental or not, in the sense that it is the kind of separate building block of reality. I mean, everything of reality depends on consciousness. So in that, from that point of view, it's quite fundamental. Another aspect what we can talk about is that consciousness in the Buddhist kind of philosophy, that consciousness is something else than the physical world. Yes. So we find consciousness as a separate kind of entity or nature, if you like. So it's interacting. Yeah, there's a cause-and-effect relationship or correlation, if you like, with brain activity. But it's an entity by itself. And then so we have, you could say, fundamental building blocks of consciousness, matter, and then we have a kind of a rest group of a dimension that is not consciousness, not matter, which is even more difficult to comprehend than consciousness itself. So in that way, you could see that consciousness is a fundamental building block for reality, but even more fundamental if you talk about how to understand reality, because that depends on consciousness, of course.
Yes, yes. There's so many things to say. I'm tempted to even just define consciousness, but I'll come back to that. So what you just described is actually the way I viewed consciousness, if it is fundamental, for many years. Since the last 4 years that I've been working on my documentary series and doing further research and more conversations with scientists, I've actually moved to a different place of understanding is not quite the right word, because of course I don't know, but I guess I've developed kind of a view of the universe if consciousness is fundamental. And in this view, what makes the most sense to me is that it's not separate from matter or separate from anything else in the universe, that it is actually fundamentally what everything is at bottom. And I've spoken to many physicists now, one of which was Carlo Rovelli, who I know you've spoken with as well. And there are many ways in which this view that I've developed of a universe in which consciousness is fundamental actually really matches the way the universe is described under new theories of quantum gravity. And so my view, I'll try to explain it as simply as possible, but the view is essentially that matter and energy and fields and all the things that we've discovered through science and some things that we just know are there because we experience them, are at bottom what they're made of. When we get closer and closer to the physics, we start breaking things apart, and eventually we find the quantum realm, which already what we understand through the science is that the quantum realm not intuitive to us in the way that the macro world that we navigate is. And so we already know that what underlies this macro world that we live in is something very, very different that's being regulated by very different laws of nature that give rise to this macro world. And that doesn't mean they're separate things. It just means that the underlying mechanisms of everything that we experience is something, in fact, very, very different. And my guess at this point is that what it actually is, what the stuff is felt experience. And actually, that brings me to my definition of consciousness. And so, it's an almost impossible thing to define because it is not something that is observed from the outside or can be spoken about from the outside. It is the experience from within. But the best analogy or the best term I've found for me is felt experience. So if there's a felt sensation, and actually quite simply, the difference between seeing the color green and understanding the underlying reality that there is no green out there in the universe that exists. There are light waves. There are leaves that absorb certain light waves and reflect certain light waves. And when those light waves interact with my retina and my brain, an experience of seeing green materializes. And it's in that experience of seeing green that I'm calling consciousness. And so, I lost my train of thought, but I guess I wanted to address this idea that you brought up of knowing and knowledge. And I think these words are tricky also because they sometimes mean slightly different things in a Buddhist context and a scientific context. But one thing I've become very curious about is whether there is something that many of us experience on meditation retreats and in other circumstances of kind of a pure awareness, a pure consciousness. And I think there's a way in which you could use the word knowing to talk about that because it still is, the awareness is there and there's a knowing in awareness. But I like to distinguish that from the things that the shapes that take form in that awareness. And sometimes neuroscientists call this the content of consciousness. So whether that's a feeling or a sight or a sound, that those things are kind of shapes that consciousness takes that give it content, but that ultimately what it is a pure consciousness that doesn't necessarily have content. So knowing is a tricky term for me there. Yeah, I feel like, I guess from the scientific perspective, knowing comes along with content. So you know the content that you're experiencing, but if there's no content at all, it's hard for me to say what the knowing refers to. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you say there's no content, for example, in meditation, if you just observe the mind itself, right? You don't have a kind of specific object rather than the mind itself, then we say then in that case, the mind itself is a content, or the mind itself becomes the object that is experiencing itself. Yeah. But yeah, I like your thoughts and I like your appreciation for Carlo Rovelli's kind of relational quantum mechanics theory. And that also is very much in line with certain forms of Buddhist philosophy. And when we had a dialogue, we also discussed various aspects of matter versus consciousness. And then Carlo Rovelli already very interesting said that matter, we think consciousness is kind of a subjective experience or first person kind of experience, but matter for that regard is not as solid as it looks like, right? So in that context, in certain types of Buddhist philosophy, we talk about the properties of matter on a subtle level are very similar to the properties of consciousness. And then it looks like sometimes that everything has consciousness, but maybe it is because those properties are extremely similar. Yeah, so that's kind of a distinction we would like to make in the Buddhist context. And what you also talked about, the aspect of the blueness or the colors or shapes we see, of course, that is formed also by our perceptions, right? That also what I like in Anil Seth's book, Being You, that it's more inside out rather than outside in. That means that the
and I
perception.
guess, I draw that analogy to the entire universe. And so when I talk about and think about matter now in this new context, if I'm, so I now kind of allow myself to assume consciousness is fundamental without really knowing. But if I start to imagine that that is the truth of our situation, matter is the interaction between one conscious experience and another. And so it's the way in which one conscious experience is affecting another conscious experience. And this is actually, I'm starting to recognize the similarities between Buddhism here as well in terms of karma and causation, because most of my work now is thinking about how different conscious experiences affect one another through time and space. And so if consciousness is fundamental in the way that I'm assuming, the truth is that each conscious experience kind of arises and passes away in and of itself. And this sense of being a self, a solid self moving through time is generated by many factors, but one is this factor of memory. And I see memory as a way that conscious experiences affect one another through time. So, I have a memory of drinking a sip of water before we began this conversation. Now, we kind of have this assumption or illusion that I can recall the memory as if I'm in that same moment again. But of course, I'm in a new moment. And this is a moment that contains some information from that past conscious experience. But that past conscious experience exists in and of itself and was a separate moment from the one I'm experiencing now. But that conscious experience of drinking water is now influencing this conscious experience that's arising now in a different moment in time. And then in space, you're having a conscious experience over there, much further than you actually look away from me. But we're having this interaction of conscious experiences in space where, just seeing your smile, I mean, just the visual, you're having a conscious experience and it is creating in my field a smiling human, but it goes so much deeper than that. You're affecting the processing of my brain. Your next thought will enter my brain in the form of, coded language that will have all of these effects on the electrical firing of my neurons. And so conscious experiences are influencing each other all the time in space in this way and in many other ways and across time through memory. But I view in the same way that I can view you as an object, what is really there is an endlessly, in a system that endlessly is giving rise to conscious experiences and falling away. And I ultimately think that it's very likely that everything we perceive is also some form of conscious experience arising and falling, and the things that we can't interact with as well as we can interact with each other. I mean, we're very similar systems, and therefore we can communicate a lot of our conscious experiences. This glass on my desk, there's, I think, very little crossover and, essentially zero ability to communicate. And maybe as part of a larger system, these are all things for science to inquire about and discover if this in fact is true. But I have this very limited ability to interact. And to me, it appears as this non-conscious matter that I interact with, when in fact, it could be that it's other types of conscious experiences arising that are affecting the conscious experiences that I'm aware of in this moment.
Yeah, sounds very much
for a while. I'm glad you're nodding your head. Yeah. We went very deep, very quickly.
Yeah, but it's very much like what we call interdependence, right? In the Buddhist
Sure.
context.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And in my view, it is interdependence. Absolutely.
And also what you touched upon, like memory and karma, for example, that
yes,
there's a very interesting philosophy how information is actually carried over time. And within the continuity of consciousness, we call that kind of karma, right?
Yeah.
But also memory in that regard, that
Sure.
we can remember certain events of the past, and
Sure.
consciousness evolves, and we can remember and interact, and also our previous perceptions or habituation patterns, so to say, they will
Yes.
influence future forms of perception. So it's a
Yes.
very integrated aspect of
Absolutely. Yes. And my view is, is a view that
process.
just by
Yeah.
definition is completely integrated and is essentially one thing, which is consciousness.
Yeah.
I mean, it
Although
clearly has a structure to it that we don't yet understand. But yeah, I now see memory as actually the way different conscious experiences affect one another through time.
Yeah.
And this also does kind of lend itself to a discussion about compassion as well, which we can shelf for now. But I find the connection between these ideas around what the universe looks like and how it's structured if consciousness is fundamental, and how that relates to compassion and our experiences of compassion. And I think why this is a with a big question mark, but I think it's possible that it also explains why compassion feels like a truer view on reality, because I think it's actually touching on this truer.
Yeah, truer view, probably in the sense that it gives people some value in life, or value
Mm,
in the meaning of life. That what
mm,
we classify compassion as a kind of virtuous mental factor. Yeah, that
yeah,
indicates that it brings virtue and it brings
mm,
kind of happiness.
yeah, yeah,
Opposite to that, we have disturbing emotions. Yeah, so we
yeah,
have a kind of constructive emotions versus disturbing emotions, and also those emotions, whatever they are, they will influence our future perceptions and future
hmm,
ways of looking at things and
hmm.
experiencing things.
Yes,
So you can see there's a constant kind of a process of
yes,
moments, and that
exactly.
stream of moments that we call the continuity of consciousness, that has
Yes,
experience and that develops, or and that
yes,
built up an habituation pattern that influence future perceptions. And
yes,
yeah, it never stops, so to
yes.
say.
It never stops. Right. Exactly. Yes.
So, and that aspect, what we say, that these emotions, either positive or negative, or you can say
Mm,
virtuous, non-virtuous, or you can say disturbing and constructive,
mm,
they also seem to influence our perception. And we know
mm.
that
Yeah. Yeah.
particular state of mind influences your mood of the day and
Yes.
influences the way you look at things.
Yes.
So in that way, you can see that these habituation patterns of the past have a very much influence in what we experience at the present.
Yes.
No, isn't it?
Yes. And yes, and as far as compassion obviously having the effect that it has on oneself and those around us, I think it also gives us a window onto a clearer view of kind of a picture of the universe where we are not separated into individual selves,
Mm,
where, in my view, where essentially the universe is just an endless arising and passing away of conscious experiences, in the same way that if you told me about a wonderful experience I had as a child that I don't happen to remember, and I might feel good that I had that experience, um, because there's no self that's there for all the experiences, that's this thought solid thing, but in fact there are these conscious experiences arising in the universe. There's no real reason why I should be happier that I had that experience than someone else had that experience. And ultimately it kind of becomes our view is one of, I mean, some people talk about it in spiritual circles as one mind, and I shy away from that language because I actually think we're then putting the illusion of self onto the whole universe. I don't like the idea of, just the larger self. I think, self disintegrating completely, and this idea of, I've actually been using an analogy of a pot of boiling water, where water is the consciousness and the bubbles are the content that come and go. And so the intuition that we do have that, I care, about my experience and my pain and my suffering. And, as a human being, usually more naturally care more about mine than others. I think this view really weaves nicely with the Buddhist view of compassion, but I also think reaches a deeper truth,
mm,
which is that we can feel joy at any beautiful happy, joyful, experiences of love that arise in the universe, as if they're our own. And likewise, we can care about the suffering that arises, that we don't necessarily call our own suffering, when you kind of realize that that's a false view of the way the universe is constructed and how consciousness is really constructed. There's a sense that it's all one, and that we can give preference to bringing as many loving and compassionate experiences into the universe, and minimizing the suffering.
Yeah, I mean, that's, as you know, quite a Buddhist principle, and those two are related, right? The aspect you mentioned of the experience of self and compassion that we see. There is no real.
I love that the sciences have brought us here as well. I think this is a very, very interesting moment, where the physics and the neuroscience are pushing us in this direction, and you could have this insight just based on that science. And of course, you can have the insight, and many have for thousands of years, from the contemplative side, from just seeing experience for what it is.
Yeah, we have just different methodologies, but we come to very similar conclusions. If we talk about no self or no intrinsic self, then Carlo Rovelli completely agrees. Everything is a nature of dependence, right? And Anil said, is the self itself is just a perception. And if you look in Thomas Metziger's kind of interesting kind of research regarding no self, then it becomes very interesting that we often think there is a self, and the more you hold on to that self, and the more you have kind of narcissistic aspect to that self, then it creates problems, right? It's kind of an aspect of emotional kind of imbalance, or emotional kind of struggle, so to say. Well, if you see that self, and you saw also with Carlo Rovelli and David Bohm in that regard, that they become much more interested in compassion aspect of life and interdependence, because there is no solid aspect of reality. Neither is this self existing in that way, and everything is nature independent. So we are responsible also for the people around us and the future, because consciousness moves forward, and our experience or our activities at the moment has an effect or correlation with the future, and that we see it a lot in the aspect of interdependence. And if you have that understanding, you combine it, what you just mentioned, with compassion, then you have a very nice kind of mixture of the science of the mind that can help the individual as well as probably society as large. So what do you think? Is there a self, or is there no self, or does consciousness self?
I can answer simply, or I can talk about it for half an hour. But no, I'm quite convinced. Well, I will say, I should be more careful as a philosopher of science. There is something, a phenomenon in nature that we can refer to as self, and I think that's an important thing to have and to discuss, and especially when we're talking about the development of children and psychology. The thing that I think is an illusion, and I think there's really almost no doubt about this now, any way you look at it, from the neuroscience perspective, from the contemplative perspective. Even just, in my docuseries, in my book, I'll ask the readers or the audience to do a short, it's really a thought experiment, but it's also like a meditation. The thing that I think is an illusion is this idea that there is a concrete entity someplace in my head, in my body. I often talk about it as claiming ownership of all the things that constitutes it in reality. So we will use language like my head, my brain, my I feel it, even though I break through this illusion on a regular basis in my daily life and in meditation. It's such a natural illusion that we walk around with. It's very easy to fall back into, feeling like there's some me in there that's been there from the beginning, maybe even was there before I was born and will continue after I die, who knows, but that it's this consistent, solid thing. And here I use the analogy of a wave, which is so often used in Buddhist analogies as well. But that the self, we can talk about a wave, and it's useful to use the word wave, and it's useful for us to talk about, especially if we're doing oceanography, or, to understand the mechanics of a wave and what it is as a phenomenon. But we can understand that a wave is not a solid thing, and there's not one wave that moves around the ocean as a solid entity that has a particular character. It is a very dynamic, ever-changing process in nature, and so the experience of self is much more like a wave than it is like any kind of static object that maintains qualities.
Yeah, very interesting. It's very Buddhist, actually.
Yes.
Because in Buddhism, we talk various aspects of course, conventionally, we're sitting here, we have a conversation, and through Zoom we meet. So there are various causes and conditions that play a role, but there's an experience. Yeah, there's a subjective experience of talking and reacting. And so there's a kind of conventional reality is existing. Yeah? But as you just also described, there's no solid intrinsic kind of I sitting somewhere in your body as such, right? So in that way, I think
and
we
I
more
think that is the useful one also psychologically and philosophically also to continually point to and recognize is a false way of viewing our situation in the world.
Yeah, and it is a process, as you just said, like a wave function or kind of a field of moments that produces. But within that field of moments, we have subjective aspects of consciousness, and one of those aspects is apprehension of the self, and that has various levels of coarser selves, less coarser selves, as you already just indicated yourself. So those kind of different levels, we're very interested in. Buddhist teaching is very much interested in that aspect of reality, because we believe that the apprehension or holding on or adherence to this kind of solid entity can cause problems. Yeah, because in one way it goes against reality, right? You have a kind of dependence, and then you think something is independent, and that doesn't work, right? So that way we say that apprehension of this independent entity that cannot exist the way it appears, and that causes problems and causes kind of emotions to arise. So to say.
So there's a usefulness to recognizing that it's not in fact true.
And we see that in the science of ego dissolution, for example, as well. With Annaka, I had very interesting discussions that there is an ego dissolution happening, but a coarse one. He also agrees on that, and that brings benefit to people. That when it happens, then they feel compassionate, more connected, because this independent, holding on to this independent entity falls away, and then of course you have an experience of being one with the environment around you, and compassion arises much more naturally, right?
Yes, that's right. I often think about if we were able to perceive all of the interconnected forces that exist. I mean, even just sound waves, how the air is moving between us, how the water we drink is, doing all of the things at the molecular level, that if we were witness to all of this, that we would see the way we in fact are embedded in nature and a part of nature. And I think most psychological suffering has its roots in this feeling of being an I, being separate, being, almost all of the harmful emotions that, or even, states of anxiety and depression and those types of things, they're really anchored to self in its most extreme form, an identity with this thing, which in reality doesn't exist.
So the Buddha, already 2,500 years ago, that was the Buddha's main kind of emphasis to teach upon, right? The one aspect that this causes kind of suffering, and if you eliminate or see that self does not exist the way it appears. And I like your distinction you often talk about between illusion with a capital I and they were not, meaning that certain aspects are an illusion and certain aspects are a conventional reality. So in Buddhism also we make that very clear distinction that this I what you just described as an independent entity. It
Mhm.
appears in that way, but that's actually
Mhm.
this illusion aspect. Well,
Right,
there's a
right,
conventional person sitting there and having a conversation. Yeah, and that's not the illusion aspect. Yeah, our body
sure.
not the illusion, our mind is not the illusion,
Right.
but the way the I appears, that's So I like that distinction you make, because we have that
Yes.
in a similar way in the Buddhist teachings as well, to
Yes.
make that distinction
Yes.
too.
I wonder if so what you brought up this phrasing that I use of capital I illusion and lowercase I illusion, and I wonder if there's any connection here between Buddhism as well, as it relates to other illusions beyond the self.
Very much.
One way I think one way I use this this example is the example I brought up earlier of seeing the color green.
Mm.
There's a reason we see the color green, and it's extraordinarily useful. All of our perceptions, the way our brains integrate information and map out our external reality, allow us essentially to survive, but to navigate the world, to pick up a piece of paper, to to be able to do all the things we need to do as human beings. And so the lowercase illusion that I talk about are things like visual illusions, when our brains do something that actually give us kind of the wrong mapping. Many people have seen visual illusions of arcs, where when you put them on top of each other, they're actually the same size, but you orient them in a certain way, and it looks like one is longer than the other. So that's an illusion that is playing out that actually makes it more difficult for us to navigate the world. It's when our brain is not, serving us in the way that we expect it to. The capital I illusions are the fact that there isn't green out there in the universe at all, right? And so I've become much more interested, and this is partly my work with Anil and other neuroscientists. I've become very interested in the way that our brains so beautifully map the outside world for us, but give us many capital I illusions that the world exists out there in the way we perceive it, rather than our perception as a map. And what's out there, like light waves and sound waves and all the other things we don't yet even understand, we're moving through a very different world than the picture of the world we're given through our perceptions. And so this is something that meditation has really helped me with as well. Being able to think more creatively about what the universe is by letting go of my natural or maybe habitual way of experiencing. Yes, the picture of the world that I think is out there is, we already know, vastly different. And I find that fascinating, and I think it's very useful to science to have tools like this for breaking through our intuitions and understanding that we're experiencing a map. We're not experiencing directly the thing. And this actually connects well with Ravelli's work as well, because if you imagine that consciousness is fundamental and that there's some structure to the universe that we don't yet understand, although we have some understanding through physics and mathematics, but that ultimately it's about conscious experiences arising in the universe. All we have are the ways in which content changes and different shapes and flavors take shape based on how these different conscious experiences are interacting with one another. And there is no way to talk about an objective world in that context. And so it's interesting to me that fits so nicely with Ravelli's view. Yeah.
Yeah, very much, because when I talk with Carlo Ravelli, we talk about similar aspects, and in certain types of Buddhist philosophy, we also say that every form of perception by itself is by definition mistaken from the point of view of the way things appear to us, not from the point of view of objects, because the blueness or the greenness, whatever we see, we can agree upon this blue and that is green.
Yes.
So from that point of view, or the color or the shape of your computer, that's not really the mistaken aspect, but the way it appears to us in an independent kind of way. That's kind of what we call the mistaken or illusion aspect. So,
Right. Well,
so that-
we share a map, but it's still a map. Yeah.
yeah, it remains a map, right? An
Yes.
approximation of reality.
Yes.
That's what
Exactly.
Anna said also indicates with his prediction brain error response kind of aspects,
Yeah.
that we create a reality we believe at a certain point, but it remains a subjective aspect that is true for us at a particular time.
I guess I wonder where my view differs from a Buddhist perspective here in terms of, this is why I don't think of the, I guess it's probably under idealism, where there's this idea that kind of mind or consciousness is what exists, and it somehow gives rise to matter. And my view doesn't match that. I see matter
Yeah.
as the way another conscious experiences is affecting, how conscious experiences affect one another, and that matter is like the map. And I don't think it's something not real, or that doesn't exist, or that we're creating in any way. It's just the map of, I don't know, I'm at a loss for the right language, but I see it all as one thing. I don't, it doesn't
Do
feel
you
right to
believe?
me to separate consciousness from matter, that I think matter is consciousness. It's our
So you
perception
think
of it from one perspective. Yeah.
matter in that regard, also whatever is matter has consciousness,
That it's
or
actually just a representation of conscious experiences arising at that point in space-time. It's the
and how
way
you
that it appears to me, in the way that your conscious experiences are appearing to me in the forms that they are, because I can never be in them. um, it's just conscious
because it remains
experiences causing other conscious experiences at bottom, and that matter is one way of mapping, or how you perceive the effect of one conscious experience on another.
But consciousness, according to you, also remains individual, right? Means it remains subjective to whoever is experiencing something.
Well, I think the content is individual, but I don't even like the word individual, because I don't think things break into things. I think conscious experience exists in and of itself from the inside, but I don't think it's individual in the sense that it's separate from.
I mean, it's separate in the sense that what you experience at a particular time might be
Yeah.
different from a person sitting next to you looking at the same kind of thing in
Sure,
front of
but I would describe that, if we're looking at the fundamental picture, I'd describe that as different shapes of consciousness, like the
you.
bubbles in the water coming in and
Mm.
out of existence in
Yeah,
the sea of consciousness.
right.
Yeah.
So yeah. In Buddhism, the view is that we remain to have the view that consciousness is individual, not in the sense as an independent entity, but that we have subjective experiences. Yeah, of course, we influence, like, what I think about and talk about, you hear and you think about and you talk about. So there's a connection. Yeah, but
Yes.
way you have a particular feeling at a moment and I have a particular feeling at a moment, they
Yes.
might be distinct in the sense of being individual, different
Yes.
from the
And but I think that's true across a human being as well.
yeah.
And memory gives us this illusion that they're being experienced by an entity or by a single thing. It's the illusion is that there's this entity that touches on all of these experiences, when it's really just, I mean, I see ultimately all the experiences that arise in consciousness in the form of some content as just arising and passing away. And the illusion is when memory affects conscious experiences over time, in a structure. I
Because
think.
our current state of consciousness or our current state of activity whatsoever will influence future forms of perception, right? So that same with memory, the information is carried over time and influence this dependent relationship.
Yes. I guess I see ultimately our interaction the same as the interaction between every moment in my life, and that there's not one perspective that I can call me.
Yeah, there's no individual moments, right? Everything.
Right.
Yeah, in one
Yeah.
way, we cannot really find the time of consciousness. If you want to find the present
Yes.
time, then
Yes.
that we
That's right.
cannot really find, right? Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Which is another interesting comparison to physics as well, because it is seeming like, well, it's space is actually very interesting to talk about in terms of our perception. I've come to believe that space is also an illusion, or an illusion in the sense of a capital I illusion, that we are given a very different sense of how the universe is structured, in the same way that we used to believe that green was a property that existed outside. We have this very strong intuition that space is a property that exists outside, and I actually think it's another way that our brains are mapping a structure of reality that is not like space in the way we experience space, very likely. But yes, I was going to say that physics at this point, every physicist I've worked with and spoken to in the last 10 years believes that space is an emergent property of something more fundamental. And many physicists, including Ravelli, I believe, although I shouldn't put words in his mouth, because I don't know for sure he subscribes to this, but some some physicists are starting to believe that time is part of space and is also emergent, and that time is not actually part of the fundamental story. That it's pointing to a deeper structure. It's not that it doesn't exist, but it's a structure that is not time-like in the way we experience it, which is interesting, because that is often the experience people have in deep meditative states as well. It's
or even no perception of time, right?
Yes, exactly. No, that's what I mean. Yeah.
So it's very subjective. Or in a dream, for example, you can experience a few seconds a lot. That in waking state take a lot of time. So,
but it's also hard to find the seconds if you look for them.
that's very good. Because as Carlo Rovelli also indicates, most likely that it's unfindable in looking for the present moment, for example.
Yes.
So there's no independent aspects in time either. So in that way, it's very similar to the continuity of consciousness. Also there we cannot really find the present moment, but there is a collection of moments that moves over time.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Although I often think about it, and I have no answer, but I think about what is consciousness without time.
That's an interesting
throw
question.
that out there.
Consciousness probably moves in time, right? So that we have an experience now.
Well, at least at the human level, we don't seem to be able to escape it. But it's interesting that we also can't find it when we look for it. Children have this insight regularly. Actually, when I work with children, they're very quick to notice when they begin practicing paying attention to the present moment, how the thing they first notice is how quickly it moves. They just say, "Oh, it's so fast," And there's nothing to hold on to, which is, I think, beautiful that children have this like ready insight. I think they bump into it much more quickly than most adults do.
They're more spontaneous without maybe too much conceptualities yet. So
They
have a kind of direct experience of things, maybe more. So the interdependence you can see going throughout time, going throughout consciousness, throughout memory, and that our current kind of states of mind influence future perceptions, right?
Yes.
So, and that also in the Buddhist view of related to what you said, memory and karma, either what color we experience and what is out there, nothing exists in an objective way. Everything is also dependent on a certain extent on the observer, and how the observer has created kind of an information pattern that makes that observer to see or hear particular things, right?
Yeah. The one place I struggle with that objective sense, though, is in that it seems that the universe does have a clear structure. And I don't think it's a structure that we could talk about from outside of it, but that, even cause and effect. There seems to be, however inaccurate our maps are, our perceptions are, there seems to be structure to consciousness and to conscious experiences. And I'm very curious about what that even means, but I have a hard time. It doesn't seem correct to me to say that things are truly objective and that they are.
But there's a structure probably in the sense of law of reality, like we already talked about, that
Yes.
narcissistic
Yes.
state of mind will produce kind of more disturbing emotions and more complicated
Yes. Yes.
minds. And compassion, on the other hand, will generate more positive states of mind and
Yeah.
experience even more happiness. So that kind of law of reality within the
Yeah.
continued consciousness,
Yeah.
that is in one way
Yeah.
kind of structure, right, or not?
Yes. 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 Absolutely. And it seems to be part of the structure. And I guess I would put that in the category of objective, but it's a little tricky that we don't quite have the right language, I think, to.
Yeah, I mean, we on a conventional level we say structure, but not an independent structure, right? It's a kind of an aspect
Yes.
of reality. We have to start
Yeah.
somewhere with
Yes.
language
Yes.
to
Yes. And
describe.
yes. And with science,
Yeah,
we have to
yeah,
start
yeah,
somewhere. Yes.
yeah, yeah. So that's why we use these kind of terminologies, but we know it doesn't exist in objective, independent way. It's just a way to describe it.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. So
Mhm.
that we in one school of Buddhist thought, we call
Mm,
everything is kind of merely designated by the mind. That
mm.
the only way we can describe things is just by describing them, then because we cannot find an independent objective entity.
Yeah. Yes. Hmm.
Then we come to the conclusion everything is kind of in the nature of this dependence of designation.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, but I think we're just talking and talking, and we didn't give Scott anything to do. But
Well, we're
maybe,
out of time. I lost track of our three questions also, so I
I
don't
mean,
know if
I
we
think we
covered
mostly
everything. Yeah.
covered the three of them. But Scott, what do you think?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Oh, hi. That was very fascinating, and you did cover all of the questions. We had planned to discuss it more, but I would love to open this up to questions. There's a lot of questions keep streaming in.
Oh, great.
If you're
Okay.
open to it, yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
sure.
Sure.
Okay. So, the first question here I quite liked. What's the significance if consciousness is fundamental?
Mm.
What should we do about that? What's the significance to the human experience? And I know both of you have slightly different takes on it based on, your scientific, philosophical quest
Mm.
and the Buddhist perspective.
Yeah. Shall I
Yeah,
go
Annaka,
first?
maybe
Okay.
you start first. Yeah.
So yes, I have a couple of answers to this. One is from the scientific perspective. Um, so this argument takes a long time to get to. So if you're interested, you can find it in my work. But essentially, I've argued that we don't have better reasons for assuming consciousness arises out of complexity at high levels of processing, like at human brains. That's all based on assumptions, many of which turn out to be illusions that we now know about through neuroscience. So, and kind of like we mentioned, science has to start with an assumption almost always, or probably always, because you can't just keep going deep. Why is that there? Why is that there? If you want to study something, you kind of start with an assumption. And if we're interested in consciousness, we have assumed so far in the sciences that consciousness arises at a high level of information processing, most likely in brains, central nervous systems. I make the argument that we actually don't have great reasons for that, and that the reasons are becoming weaker and weaker as we learn more about the brain for assuming that. And so I'm interested in what would happen in the sciences if we assumed that consciousness is fundamental. And I'll have an argument for why it's, if there's no place it arises, it goes all the way down. And so it's kind of what we're kind of faced with having to choose from two assumptions when we look out at the universe, at all the organisms and collections of matter that have developed. We can say, which collections of matter entail conscious experiences and which don't. And we really, at this point, knowing what we know, having the limited knowledge we have, we either have to say some or all, because we know the answer isn't none. We know our own conscious experiences exist. And so they're either some, it arises at some point in some processing, there's some reason for it, it emerges, or it's in everything. And I'm very interested in how the sciences would proceed if we started with this other assumption. What if consciousness is fundamental? And I actually think even if we can't ever get to a true understanding of what that means, I actually think, and I've already seen evidence of this, that it moves our science in a different direction. And science asks different questions, which is one of the most important processes of the scientific method is asking questions. Different questions arise if you think consciousness is fundamental. I also think there's some very interesting implications for what's happening with different theories of quantum gravity, ways that certain conundrums can be resolved. And so I think it has implications for science, even if we can never fully grasp what it means. I actually think it could lead us in new and interesting directions, and will create many experiments and lines of thought that just haven't happened yet because we've always assumed consciousness arises out of complex processing. So I think there's a whole world. I even talk about a scientific revolution. If enough scientists become convinced that this is a legitimate path to follow, I think there's a whole realm of science that has not yet been explored, that neuroscience can actually help us navigate. At the last chapter of my documentary series is called The Future of Science, and I talk about some hypothetical experiments that may start taking place. We have information about split brain patients, which I won't go into much detail here, but this is all in my work as well, where patients who have epilepsy have undergone a callosotomy, so their right and left hemispheres are split surgically, and that actually seems to create two centers of consciousness. What might happen if we are able to connect two brains, and what happens to the experience of consciousness, the experience of self, when we're able to do that type of science. I think there's also very interesting implications for memory. As we were talking about, the memories that I do have, I have this sense of what it was like to be a 5-year-old tripping over my shoelaces. I have this memory of that. There's no real reason why I couldn't have a memory from someone else's life experience. So because each new conscious experience is generated anew in each new moment, there's a conscious experience that existed in the past that I had, that now is in my stream of memory that I have access to. It's not quite the right way to talk about it. It more can influence the way I experience things now. But, if somehow in some future scientific method, we could have, Scott share his memory of eating granola this morning, and that would become a part of my stream of memory. I'd have an experience of when I was 5 and I tripped over my shoelaces, and when I was at my desk preparing for this event, and when I was Scott eating granola this morning. And I think there's a way in which things like that experiential types of science where we actually change our experiences, could actually give us a better window onto reality, and get us to break out of these illusions of self and things that I think are kind of getting in the way. So it was a very long answer to how I think it could influence the sciences. More simply, I think if we had much more evidence that we could actually start to believe or assume that consciousness is fundamental, I think that really would change the way we experience the world. And it's hard to know how that would affect different people differently. But I often give the analogy of, learning. There was a time where the planet was full of human beings who thought the Earth was flat and that we were the center of the universe and that the sun was whirling around us. And of course, it seems that way. And that's what our perceptions and intuitions lead us to believe. And the sciences give us this information. They give us a very different picture of where we are, that there's this vast universe and we're orbiting one of many, many stars. And we don't take that into account in our daily lives usually, but just knowing that fact, I actually think shifts the way we are in the world, the way we experience the world, the kinds of thoughts we have. And so I think if we actually had enough evidence to believe that the universe was just teeming with consciousness, and that ultimately that's what matter is, that's what energy is, that it's some form of interacting, arising conscious experiences. I think we can't know in advance what effect that would have on humanity, but I have no doubt that would change things for us. And my guess is that it would change things for the better.
Yeah, I mean, change for the better for sure. Because if there's more scientific kind of research being done regarding consciousness as being fundamental, I think then a very interesting aspect of mind science going to play a role. And in Buddhist view, the Buddha was mainly interested in consciousness being fundamental from the point of view we strive for aims in life, wanting happiness, not wanting suffering, and how is that created? Yeah, so these kind of aspects of the continuity of consciousness we talked about, or positive state of mind, of negative states of mind, and how to influence that law of reality, of interdependence within the continuity of consciousness. That's very interesting, because we want to develop our minds in a particular way that brings not only benefit to ourselves, but also benefit to the people around us. And our activities are based on mental states. Yeah, whatever physically or verbally we engage in, it's based on mental states. So whatever decisions we make, and particular people in positions to make big decisions for communities or societies or countries, then the more science we have behind these positive patterns of consciousness, that will influence in a very positive way the people start thinking about things. And I think that's kind of a very important aspect of science to be developed, to get this understanding of, and that all starts most likely with taking consciousness seriously as being fundamental.
I want to ask you both a question about to follow up on that, about the relationship between ethics and consciousness. I read a very disturbing article in the New York Times by Barbara Montero last week. I don't know if you saw it, Annaka, but it was, I'll tell you, I'll just explain it. You don't have to look it up. But she was saying that that it was about whether AIs are conscious. And she was saying, well, maybe they are, or they will be soon. And she said, this debate about whether then we have to set them free or give them rights. She said, we don't have to worry about that, because we already have decided that human consciousness is superior, because we enslave animals, we kill animals, we eat them. So why not enslave the AIs too? This conclusion made me very upset.
Yes, well,
how
it's
would
understandable.
but it contradicts what both of you said, that if we believe that consciousness is fundamental and widespread, that it would deepen our ethics and compassion. But it seems like not for all people. What is that argument for between consciousness and ethics?
Although I will say, though, that we've grown further and further away from this view. The more scientific we understanding of the consciousness of animals. I mean, I know many people who will not eat octopus anymore. And that's based on, recent research. We can't communicate with them. And so the less a system is similar to a human being, the less we have access to what types of conscious experiences are arising there. But yes, of course, first of all, there will always very likely be psychopaths, and there's a scary diversity of human minds, I think, out there. Maybe there's some future thousands and thousands of years from now where those things pass away. But so I think there's that. But I actually do think that we have become more compassionate over time based on the scientific understanding, and that there was a time when we truly thought human beings were superior, and there are less and less people who feel that way now. And yeah, it may not affect everyone, but I think there are large categories of human beings who would shift the way they feel, understanding that consciousness is actually going much deeper and is much more prevalent in the universe. And, not necessarily, I think there'll be very interesting conversations about suffering, what types of systems can suffer and what types of systems don't, or are such different types of suffering from humans that, when I say the consciousness is fundamental, I'm imagining, the nucleus of an electron being something that I could never fathom. If I just think of another, if I think of a whale or a bat that I'm pretty convinced already has conscious experiences, those experiences, an experience of navigating the world through sonar, I can kind of imagine it, but I can never know what that is. And I think the more we diverge in terms of the types of systems we are, the less we can have an analogy even to the types of experiences that are arising there. And I don't know how far down, this is something I think about. I don't know how far down suffering goes. I don't know how to think about suffering once we leave the animal and insect realm. And I think those are very interesting questions.
Yeah, Geshe-la. Go.
So in the
Geshe-la.
Buddhist perspective, we say that every living sentient being, or every living being has consciousness, has also the mental factor feeling. Yeah, we have feeling is we consider as an omnipresent mental factor. We cannot prevent feeling something, either suffering or happiness or neutral aspects. So, and that mental factor is present in all forms of consciousness, meaning all living beings in that way, like animals, even insects, they have consciousness, although their consciousness is much more coarser from the point of view related with human intelligence. But there is an aspect of feeling, it's omnipresent mental factor feeling. And based on those kind of understandings, we try to develop an ethical way of life that prevents harming beings, because beings have consciousness, and if beings consciousness, they have feelings. So we don't like to be harmed ourselves. We don't like the feeling of suffering. So based on that understanding, we try to see that other sentient beings, as we call them, have the same form of consciousness, same form of feeling, and we don't like to be harmed, so we don't harm them. And that's why we try to practice this ethics or morality, and also based on the interdependence, as we just talked about previously, that every action we engage in has its consequence. I mean, there's a continuity of information carrying over time. And also that has to be, in the Buddhist context, is be taken into account. Yeah.
I'd also say, on the topic of AI, which may give you some comfort, I think if consciousness is fundamental, even though AI behavior is becoming more and will become more and more similar to human behavior, I think the actual matter, the actual system, the actual what it is made of is so different from a human that even though, and this is where it gets very tricky, and I think we run into all kinds of strange terrain, and we'll have a lot of philosophizing to do. But I think if consciousness is fundamental, and we created a very successful robot, humanoid robot that looked like a human and spoke like a human and talked about human feelings, if consciousness is fundamental, I would expect the experience on the inside of all of that behavior to be completely unimaginable from our perspective. I would not expect us. And so I think it'll be the first time in nature where we can't use our intuitions about similar behavior to map onto similar experience. And that's very, very odd position for humans to be in. But it doesn't make sense to me that such a different type of system would have the same internal experiences.
Yeah.
It's not like creating human beings.
So we have an interesting question here, because we were both talking a bit about memory, and the person, Mike, asks, if memory, as Annaka was talking about, is kind of past consciousness talking to present consciousness, why is it so faulty and fallible? And it's also, Geshe-la, you often talk about information theory, and that theoretically we have a kind of perfect matrix of information that's never lost. So for both of you, this question from Mike is quite good. Then why is our memory so faulty and changing?
No, I think that is why. Because it's one conscious experiencing affecting another conscious experience later in time. It's not a photocopy. That's kind of the illusion of our memory, is that, and it's kind of how we can see that having a memory of an experience is not the same as being back in that experience, that moment of experience came and went, and you kind of move through time, and each is a new experience. And there's a way in which past experiences are affecting future experiences, but they're not bringing them back. So, they can affect them in all kinds of ways. Sure. Yeah,
it's very similar. Almost the same, basically, that, of course, our memory of an experience is not the experience, but the memory of the experience has a similarity to the experience of being displayed. So in that way,
there's some information that's carried through. Some of it is, to a much lesser
and
fidelity.
memory is often, in that way, it's not experience itself, although it can influence and then produce a new kind of experience. And that new experience can be kind of an experience by itself. It can be remembered later on. So in that way,
Yes.
you have to make a distinction between,
Mm.
the memory of an experience and experience itself.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, we can generate false memories also.
Yeah.
or imaginations, or
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good. So Lauren asks, in a theory of fundamental consciousness, how do you account for more complex conscious experiences like intelligence, cognitions? She says, what is the consciousness of a glass of water? And is there something about our brain that gives rise to the more complex experiences that may be emergent?
Yeah. So this is, this is a fascinating world of questions and things to think about that I seem to not ever be able to stop thinking about. So, I mean, first to talk about, a glass of water or a rock. People often talk about a rock, or I don't know why silverware comes up. Is my fork conscious? I think there we are really misled by the illusion of self. And, the human brain is a very particular system. It's a very particular structure in space-time that includes memory, that includes, all of these types of processes that have a felt experience to them. I would never expect, I mean, the glass of water can't even be described as an integrated system. And so there's no experience of the glass of water. I think, I obviously don't know how these things work, but my guess is that the molecules that compose the water and the glass, that it is millions, billions of countless, very minimal, I mean, just based on what the matter is that's there and how it compares to the complexity of a human brain. If consciousness is fundamental, I would expect those to be very fleeting, very minimal. It's hard to get to very minimal experiences as a human because ours are so complex, but I try to think about things like a pinprick, like the single feeling of a pinprick on your finger. If that were an experience that in and of itself arose and passed away, I don't think it's like a finger prick because it's not a human experience, but I would expect it to be a collection of billions or trillions of endless, very minimal experiences coming in and out of being when we talk about something like a glass of water. I also think it's possible that we're perceiving only small elements of other conscious experiences, and so I can't speak to the science of dark matter or dark energy or all the things that we have yet uncovered. I mean, there's so much we don't understand about the universe, but I often wonder if, the things that we have minimal interaction with, like a glass of water, is part of some other system where we're only interacting with a very small piece of it. Sarah Walker is a astrophysicist who actually, Namdak, I think you would love speaking with her. I don't know if you know her work, but
I like her assembly theory, actually.
Yes. And she talks about, she uses this term structures in time that I love. And that kind of relates to this in that, sorry, I feel like I'm maybe meandering into it. I'm not really answering the direct question anymore. Will you remind me of the question again, just so I can make sure to circle back to what she was actually getting at?
I think just go ahead with your thoughts. I think what you have to say is right. They often say answer the question that you wanted to be asked. So go ahead with your thoughts.
So yes, I think in terms of thinking about inanimate objects as having conscious experiences, we can't anthropomorphize that there's some kind of unified, integrated experience like that of a human mind, and that it's more helpful for us to I think the best we can do is think of the most individual, most minimal experiences we have. And if those were not connected over time in an object in time, the way that Sarah talks about it, if they simply just didn't get passed on to a new moment through memory, they just come and go. I imagine that inanimate objects are more like that type of consciousness, lacking memory, lacking integration. And so it's, the simplest forms of flavors of experience coming into and out of existence.
Yeah, so from the Buddhist perspective, I think here we have maybe a slightly a different kind of approach.
Yes.
That's okay, right? So,
Yes.
what you just mentioned, Sandra Walker, her theory of assembly theory is very interesting in one way,
Yeah.
that how an inanimate, kind of like a glass of water, inanimate phenomenon, actually similar to consciousness, has a process over time. There's information
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
does get lost, and that has
Yeah.
influence on future states of the glass of water. But
Right.
that doesn't imply that it has consciousness as we define it in the Buddhist context of that which is clear and knowing. Yeah, it has
Yes.
similar properties of information carried over time,
Yes.
but it's not classified as such as having consciousness or being consciousness as such. So in that way, we make a distinction between innate kind of objects and
Yes.
sentient kind of beings.
Right. So yeah, so in my view, I've stopped making that distinction, even though it's
Mm.
completely counterintuitive. But in my conversation with Sarah in my series, I think it's chapter 9, but she's in one of the chapters. Um, she she's actually willing to talk about every single object in nature, animate and inanimate, as essentially the same thing. And so being able to, she'd be very careful in how she phrased this, but essentially that everything that comes into being in the universe is actually in the category of life, even though we make this distinction at the level of the cell. I have a kind of interesting question that I keep asking, that I keep coming back to in terms of the development of a cell, in terms of suffering. And my intuition at this point, if consciousness is fundamental, and I keep saying if because I certainly don't believe it or know it, I think it's a possibility. And so I like to think about, what would the universe look like if? So if consciousness is fundamental, I think it's likely. I have developed an argument for why suffering begins at the formation of life, and we don't have the best definition of life yet, but my feeling is that it's at the level of the cell, that the moment a system has created itself as a system that persists through time, that has a distinction between itself and its environment. So a cell and the bath of chemicals, that kind of the cell comes into being at the same moment the bath of chemicals comes into being. This is Adam Frank's point. He's an astrophysicist who talks about life. That process intrinsically entails suffering because it requires energy. I mean, it's essentially fighting entropy is where suffering comes online. This is just a guess. This is just something I've been thinking about lately, but that maybe there isn't suffering across the universe, but suffering where we see life, because you intrinsically at that moment, it being a system that has to sustain itself, you have to keep ingesting energy, you have to distinguish yourself from the outside, and it inevitably entails competition, death, the thing that has created itself is trying to avoid. All the things that human beings suffer, I think, could suffer at on a much more minor level. Having to consume food, inevitably becoming damaged, which leads to pain and all the rest. So I do see this life, this border of life and non-life. For me, I'm starting to think about it as where suffering begins, but not where consciousness begins.
Yeah, it's a kind of a gray zone, right? Because if you look
Definitely. It's a very gray zone, yes.
single cell organisms, for example, then most of the Buddhist perspective, we will say if that whatever that organism is, if it strives for happiness and like to avoid suffering, that indicate kind of consciousness, as we say. Yeah.
Right. Yes. Yeah. I just see consciousness being deeper than that, but yes, that's where.
Of course, there's more levels to it, of course, but that is
Yeah.
just one measurement we could look at.
Or that's where, yes, a desire to persist and pain and all the other types of suffering could begin. Yeah.
Someone asks whether you can both comment on non-ordinary states of consciousness like meditation, psychedelics, trances, dreams. probably others. Can you talk a little bit about how each of your theories of consciousness relate to those states?
I think Namdak should take this one first.
Okay.
Okay.
I mean, talking in neuroscientific terms, we talk about content and level often, right? That consciousness has various levels, and the way we experience content depends on the level of consciousness as well. So in deep meditative kind of experience, then when consciousness becomes much more subtle, and in particular when sensory perceptions are become more dormant and only the mental consciousness is manifest in a subtle way, the way you experience things is different from the ordinary sensory perceptions. Yeah. So and the subtler the consciousness becomes, the experience becomes different. Yeah. So the level of consciousness influences our perception as well. So there's a correlation between more deeper states of meditation, so to say, that influences your perception at that moment, but also over time, as we know habituation patterns influence even brain activity. So if we know from the research of meditators who've done between 15,000 and 50,000 hours of meditation, that the gamma waves they produce is kind of quite unique. But what we don't see in people who do not engage in these practices. So on the long term, also it carries a kind of very positive effect to use those kind of advanced levels of consciousness in a particular kind of structured way to produce more constructive states of consciousness, or what we call positive states of mind.
Yeah, I would say so. Actually, I'll start with our mutual friend, Anil Seth, the neuroscientist, has brought this phrase back, your brain hallucinates your reality. And that's kind of another way of describing how, there are certain light wavelengths that bounce off a leaf and enter our retina and then goes through this brain processing and produces this experience of green. And how we can be, how of course that experience is it's as real as anything else in the universe, apart from whatever physical is happening outside and the process that takes place. An experience of green has just materialized in the world. That experience happened, right? Whatever the cause of it is. And so there are ways in which our brain hallucinates our reality, which is really giving us a map of these incoming signals and our perceptions, that create these capital I illusions and are great for navigating the world and are great for survival, but are not necessarily useful for understanding the underlying reality, the deeper reality. And one of the things I find so fascinating about meditation is that it can quiet certain circuits of the brain that create these maps for us. And so it explains, one thing that explains why the sense of self, the illusion of self, can drop away in states of meditation. I became very interested in some point at how time and space seem to drop away in certain states of meditation, given my work with scientists, understanding that those are likely also perceptions and maps of reality that aren't quite accurate, that give us a sense that time is a concrete thing, that space is a concrete thing, that green is really out there. And so it kind of untrains our brain from creating these maps that we become convinced are reality itself. And so I think, and psychedelics can do very similar things. So it kind of, undoes these connections that we've made and enables us to drop into a much purer state of consciousness, which I don't think necessarily leads to a deeper understanding, but I think in many circumstances can lead to actually a more direct perception of true reality, and less clouded by all of these maps that are, so useful for our everyday lives and survival, but that don't necessarily have to be, we can experience consciousness without them. And so I think they're incredibly useful for all kinds of insights, scientific and psychological and otherwise.
A couple people have asked, what is the connection between consciousness and sentience, or what is the connection between consciousness and life?
Yeah.
Which you hinted at a little bit, but I think it's worth addressing. Yeah.
So I actually love the definition of sentience. And so when in my book, in my documentary series, I always start by doing my best to define what I mean by the word consciousness when I use it, because people use it to describe different things. And often when people think of consciousness, they think of human consciousness and complex thought and self-awareness and all these other things. And I'm obviously pointing to something that's much more basic. That's the fact of felt experience, that if an ant or a worm has any level of consciousness, it does not include self-awareness and complex thought. It's just, very basic perception, feeling, some, minimal form of vision. And so, of course, I've lost the question.
Just the
Sorry.
relationship between consciousness and sentience, or
Yes.
consciousness and
Okay.
life. Yeah.
So I always look for words that kind of get at this more basic sense of consciousness. Felt experience is always the one I land on. But when you look up the term sentience in the dictionary, it actually gives a much better description of what I'm talking about as consciousness. And I don't know if I can remember exactly, but in my book, I quote both Merriam-Webster and the Oxford English Dictionary. One phrase is susceptibility to sensation, which I love because it points to this possibility of a pure consciousness that is susceptible to there being content. So kind of an awareness that, feeling can arise and thought can arise and a vision can arise. And so I think sentience, in its actual definition in the dictionary, is exactly what I mean by consciousness. Life, again, is a really gray area. And it's interesting to look at the sciences right now because there is no very good definition of life. And I think we often confuse life with consciousness because we assume consciousness only exists in life. But again, if you look into Sarah Walker's work, which is fascinating, and I highly recommend her book, she really is trying to define life, and it proves to be an almost impossible project. And so, if I'm going to define life as a single cell organism, and I think, that's a pretty fair place to draw the line. I think that it's very likely consciousness is actually a much more fundamental part of the universe than life. Although I think I've got to the point in my conversations with Sarah that life and consciousness, at least she and I are maybe talking about the exact same thing, that we mean the same thing by life and consciousness, and that they both go all the way down, that everything is actually a form of life and a form of consciousness.
Yeah, very similar. I think I mostly agree with what Annaka just said, that, sentient. Yeah, in we have to think that we have a Buddhist tradition from Sanskrit translated in Tibetan and now in English. So the term sentient being, for example, we often use in Buddhist context. There's a translation of the Tibetan sem-chen, which means sem means mind, chen is a possessive particle. So that which possesses mind, that which possesses consciousness. That's how we define sentient. And that is, as we just talked about, and consciousness that has, the consciousness that has a mental factor feeling. Whenever there's consciousness, there's a mental factor feeling present. So that implies an experience of either suffering, happiness, or neutral states. So that's kind of an aspect of what we call sentient, and we just discussed. There's a gray zone, what actually is sentient and what not. If you look at single cell organisms, for example, and we define it in a particular way. And then life is similar. Is kind of the definition at the moment. It's a bit not very clear what we actually mean with life. Is a tree life? Is a brick, a rock? Is that life? Those kind of aspects we have to define first of all. That life seems to be slightly different from what we call sentient. So. And then we end up in this gray zone of what actually, where is the difference between when is it sentient and when not.
Well, it looks like we've reached the end of this wonderful conversation. What a nice way to spend Saturday morning here, evening there. I want to thank you both for taking your time to talk about such meaningful topics with a wonderful audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you very much, Scott, for moderating, and Annaka for amazing works you have done, and I'm looking really forward to your new book based on Light's
Yeah.
Home.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah,
no,
me too.
this was a joy. Thank you.
And I'd like to remind people too that if you enjoyed this conversation, that Science and Wisdom Live offers a self-paced course called Exploring Consciousness that has has some wonderful discussions with some of the people mentioned today, like Anil Seth, Carlo Rovelli, going into depth about some of the questions we talked about today. So check it out if you're interested. You can find the link in the chat or on the website. Well, thank you all very much.